The sun never truly sets in the Arctic summer, and in the winter, it barely rises. But for generations, Inuit hunters had one tool to help them survive both the blinding glare and the deadly chill. A carved piece of driftwood with two narrow slits. It didn't look like much, but it kept them alive tonight. We're going to follow that simple invention, not through triumph or conquest, but through quiet survival. From a worn snow goggle cracking in an icy hut, to careful repairs made by firelight, you'll discover how a forgotten tool endured centuries of use and change. So settle in, close your eyes, and let's step softly into the hush of the snow, where boring history is the warmest blanket of all. Chapter 1. Slits in the Snow. A narrow view of survival. The wind is a whispering thing, sifting across the surface of a frozen sea. You hear it even now, faint and low, like breath on bone. Imagine yourself not as you are now, but as an 18th-century Inuit hunter somewhere along the southern coast of Baffin Island. It is early spring, but the landscape does not care. Ice still stretches out like cracked porcelain in every direction. The sun bounces from every surface with an intensity so blinding, it threatens to peel your vision away. That is, unless you're wearing slitted snow goggles fashioned from driftwood, caribou antler, or even carved bone. They sit tight against your face, cutting down the sunlight to a narrow horizontal view. You don't think of them as goggles, exactly. They're just part of you like mittens or your knife. But what happens when they break? In modern times, snow blindness is a temporary condition solved with sunglasses and rest. In your world, snow blindness means death. If not yours, then that of your family, who will now have to hunt without you. The glare is constant. The white is endless. And so, in 18th century Inuit culture, the maintenance of your snow goggles isn't a hobby. It's a matter of communal survival. The materials used to make the goggles came from what the landscape allowed. Soft driftwood from distant forests that had long since floated north, or denser caribou antler shaved thin with slate tools. The eye slits were rarely more than a few millimeters wide, enough to navigate crevasses and chase seal shadows beneath the ice, but narrow enough to shield your eyes from total ruin. The design was passed down, not just generationally but seasonally. Each person in a hunting camp knew how to modify their goggles to fit their face, layering them with moss padding or seal sinew bindings to keep them tight in windstorms. Men would scrape the wood with flakes of chert. Women might sew tiny sealskin strips for better face adhesion. Children learned early how to tell when the slits were too wide. It was a group effort. Silent, often boring, but crucial repairs were routine. A broken goggle arm might be replaced using sinew thread soaked in whale oil for flexibility. Sometimes a crack was filled with boiled bone glue, a slow, sticky process requiring time and patience, not to mention access to bone material. If no bone was available, hunters often stuffed snow inside broken seams to hold the shape temporarily, hoping it would hold until the next camp. All this repair work took place in snow shelters or inside communal igloos. The smell was a mix of tallow smoke, seal fat, and wet caribou fur. Tools were limited. Most households had one or two pieces of good slate sharpened, not for killing, but carving. A misstep with your blade might ruin a week's work, and so the process was deliberate. Goggles weren't tossed when broken. They were fixed, glued, adjusted, rebent in steam. The people understood something modern societies often forget. There is no version of life without maintenance. To outsiders, this daily routine might seem mundane. Who cares about how snow goggles are repaired? But to Inuit communities, it was part of a larger ethic of care for tools, for the body, for the land. Time spent patching goggles wasn't wasted time. It was investment in the next hunt, the next safe journey across the ice. Occasionally, you might come across goggles shaped differently, slits curved or flared at the edges. These were local adaptations, fine-tuned to each person's preferences, visibility needs, or even spiritual beliefs. Some believed that properly aligned slits helped them see into the spirit world beneath the ice. Others simply liked the better contrast it gave when tracking narwhal. And even in death, these goggles remained important. Archaeologists have uncovered burials from the 1700s where snow goggles were buried, alongside the body, sometimes laid gently across the eyes as though to prepare the deceased for another long hunt. This time beneath the surface of memory, the quiet resilience of the Inuit people didn't come from big inventions or heroic acts. It came from the details, from mending a wooden slit, from binding a strap tighter, from the patient observation of light and glare. You wonder, sitting there by the warmth of your imagined lantern, how many lives were saved not by courage, by someone quietly fixing a crack with sinew thread. If something so small could matter so much, what else have we overlooked in the silent toolkit of survival? Chapter 2. The Fog-Free Frontier. Daily vision on the frozen hunt. You're awake before the sun. But then again, during some months, the sun doesn't really rise. It just stretches, lazily smearing light along the horizon like someone brushing chalk across stone. Still, you're moving. Your hands reach first for the snow goggles resting beside your bedding, not out of habit, but out of muscle memory. To step outside without them, even for a few minutes, is a mistake paid in tears and days of blindness. In this second section, we go deeper, not just into the ice, but into the repetitive, slow-motion rhythm of life that made snow goggles so deeply necessary. These weren't marvels of fashion or prestige. They were everyday tools. And the longer you examine them, the more they tell you about the quiet brilliance of 18th century Inuit survival. Function over fashion, unlike later Western. Goggles brass-rimmed, glass-lensed, and fog-prone, the Inuit design was anti-fog by nature. There was no lens to steam up, just narrow slits carved through bone or wood, positioned to reduce the light hitting the retina while preserving as much peripheral vision as possible. The slits weren't random. They were measured by feel, by intuition, by the long observation of snow and shadow. The goggles fit tightly across the upper cheek and forehead, blocking reflected sunlight that came from below as well as above. The strap was often braided sinew, flexible but strong, tied in a simple knot at the back or looped through small holes in the wood. Over time, the inner side would conform to the user's face, sometimes padded with moss or soft hide for insulation. Some families even passed them down grandfather to father to son. Repairs, again, were a family affair. Children practiced on toy goggles, scraping tiny lines into soapstone or driftwood, imitating what they saw. Mothers might add decorative stitching, not for vanity, but so you'd know whose goggles were whose in a shared snow house. One pair might have triangular scratch marks. Another might be notched on the left edge. Symbols passed quietly. The sound of travel across the tundra wasn't fast. Most trips were planned days in advance. Dog sleds were common, but not always available. Much travel was still done on foot or by kayak along thawed inlets. Either way, the goggles were worn constantly during daylight. Removing them just to rub your eyes could cost you days of painful recovery. You didn't see the same way in these goggles. They narrowed your vision, but also heightened your awareness. You learned to read subtle contrasts in the ice, the darker gray of a thin patch, the soft contour of a snowdrift hiding a hole, the blur of seal breath escaping from a blowhole 40 feet away. You weren't looking at the world. You were filtering it. The knowledge of how to navigate like this wasn't written anywhere. It was taught through shared experience. A father might kneel beside his son and point silently toward the sea, the only clue being the shift in a shadow or the way the wind lifted the edge of the snow. The goggles helped you see not more, but more precisely, goggles in the community. At seasonal gatherings, often when families converged after weeks apart, goggles were a common sight. Sometimes a visitor would notice a clever improvement. A better fit curve, a different binding method. These innovations spread slowly. A better snow slit here, a stronger strap there. But no one rushed change. The traditional design worked. It didn't need revolution, just care. In rare cases, a spiritual figure, an angakuk, or shaman might wear goggles inscribed with specific markings, believed to help them see into other realms. These were not for daily wear. They were ceremonial, often buried with their owners. They, too, told a story about how sight was not merely a physical thing, but a form of perception, a cultural memory passed down in carved lines, contact with outsiders. European traders and missionaries arriving in the Canadian Arctic during the 18th century often failed to grasp the genius of these devices. There are written accounts of early explorers mocking the goggles as primitive or crude. They soon learned, however, what happened without them. One Jesuit record from the 1760s describes a missionary nearly rendered blind after just a few hours outside without protective wear. Inuit hosts gave him a pair of bone goggles. He wrote of them as awkward and strange, but admitted they spared his sight. Some outsiders attempted to replicate the goggles with European tools, but the results clumsier, heavier, less suited. To the face rarely worked as well. It was a recurring lesson in Arctic contact. The Inuit weren't missing European technology. They had developed their own, tuned precisely to their land when the light changes. In autumn and spring, when light levels shift rapidly, the use of goggles became especially important. Sunlight reflecting off melting snow created new hazards. Hunters were taught how to slightly widen their slits or add extra layers when conditions changed. This adaptability was crucial. One wrong adjustment could mean losing a target or worse, falling through a weakening patch of ice. Sometimes, elders would inspect a hunter's goggles before a trip, testing the slits by holding them up to a burning oil lamp, checking the glow through each eye slot. If too much light escaped, they'd be sent back to recut, refit, rebind. No one argued. Everyone understood. The smallest glare could become a punishment carved into memory, so you see, these weren't just goggles. They were a way of thinking, a way of preparing, a discipline that made survival look effortless, when in fact it was the result of layers upon layers of quiet, persistent knowledge. A life lived through slits, not because of limitation, but because of wisdom. But what happens when the landscape itself begins to change, when the driftwood stops arriving, or the sea ice begins to crack sooner than expected? Chapter 3. The Vanishing Driftwood and the Legacy of Slits. You're sitting inside a low, quiet snow house. The curved walls dull the wind outside into a gentle whisper. Your goggles rest nearby, the slits catching just enough of the seal oil. Lamps glow to resemble eyes of their own. They've been repaired 3 times. You know the grain of the wood as well as the wrinkles in your grandmother's hands. But there's a crack forming now, one that runs deeper than the bone. This section, the final one in the story, explores how the tradition of snow goggles endured, not just in the 18th century, but into the 19th and 20th, until, slowly, the world changed around them. The driftwood stopped coming. Trade goods arrived in its place. And yet, the knowledge did not vanish. It adapted, repurposed, and echoed forward. The driftwood clock. Driftwood wasn't just a building material. For many Inuit families, it was a calendar. When the sea delivered nothing, it signaled something was off, currents had shifted, or storms had redirected the flow. Most snow goggles were made from this ocean-carried wood. Lightweight, cured by salt and sun, and shaped by someone who had carved 1,000 times before. But as European ships began sailing farther north in the late 1700s, their metal, cloth, and tools created both opportunity and disruption. Trade routes changed. The demand for pelts intensified. Families began to substitute imported materials, scrap wood from crates, copper wiring from barrels, sometimes even bits of metal from discarded weaponry. The result? Goggles changed form. Some grew heavier. Others lost their curved fit. Repairs became harder because the materials weren't meant for rework. And yet, many still clung to the traditional style, as if holding onto the past by the slit. In a few communities, elders insisted on using only bone or driftwood. Not for nostalgia, but for trust. You could reshape bone. You couldn't reforge steel in a snow hut. The arrival of glass. Glass arrived in earnest by the 1800s. Traders brought spectacles. Colonizers brought ideas of modernity. Goggles were scoffed at, labeled as relics, even though the imported lenses fogged and froze in seconds when exposed to the Arctic wind. There's a record from 1829 of an English expedition member trying to wear brass-rimmed snow spectacles. They froze to his skin. He returned with bandages and humility. Some Inuit did experiment, embedding thin pieces of imported glass into goggles. But this was rare. The climate punished anything not designed for its rhythm. Fog, frost, glare, it didn't care if your goggles looked civilized, and still, the slits endured. Cultural friction and quiet persistence. By the mid-19th century, Christian missionaries had begun converting and schooling Inuit children. They brought books, clothing, and discouragement of native crafts. Snow goggles, seen as primitive or pagan, were sometimes banned in these mission schools. Children were told to wear wool caps and western coats, even if the old clothes worked better. Some elders continued to carve goggles in secret. They stored them behind sleeping rolls, taught the cuts at dusk, whispered the methods in the safe hush of snow-covered huts. In some places, only adults wore them. In others, they became ceremonial, worn on hunts, then hidden afterward. Ironically, as anthropology grew, Western museums began collecting these artifacts. Museums in Denmark, Britain, and later the United States acquired Inuit snow goggles, sometimes paying for them, often not. The objects were studied, displayed, admired, but in the villages they were taken from, they were still being used, a functional legacy. Into the 20th century, as snowmobiles and modern gear arrived, goggles evolved again. Ski masks, tinted visors, and commercial sunglasses made their way into the north. Many younger hunters adopted them. But some still carried the old ways, at least in memory. One Inuit carver in the 1930s spoke to an American researcher about his bone goggles, saying, "I see with these the way my father saw. The world looks smaller, but also more clear." When asked why he still used them, he replied simply, "They do not lie today." Replicas of traditional snow goggles are still made, some by artists, others by elders teaching their grandchildren. Museums display them. Tourists buy them. But in a few communities, real goggles are still carved. Not for show, not for nostalgia, but for walking under the low sun when the light cuts too sharp across the snowdrift. Because you never forget the first time you saw the world clearly through a slit. The shape of endurance. It's tempting to see snow goggles as a small footnote in the history of Arctic survival. But in truth, they're a perfect symbol of something greater. Adaptation without spectacle. These weren't inventions in the heroic firework sense. They were shaped day by day by the needs of the people who wore them. They weren't perfect. They cracked. They warped. They fogged when worn too close to the face. But they worked. They kept people alive. They protected stories and vision. And independence, in the end, what endures isn't always what dazzles. Sometimes it's what fits your face, carved by someone who once wore the same shape of fear, squinting against the light of a land that didn't care how clever you were, only how prepared. And if you hold a pair now, wooden, or even modern plastic, you're not just holding protection. You're holding a lineage. You're looking through a slit carved in the memory of 1,000 mornings of snow. If you've made it this far, I hope the quiet rhythm of history helped you drift a little closer to sleep, or at the very least, a little further from the noise of today. Here on Quite Boring Sleep, we believe even the dullest corners of the past deserve a second glance, not for drama, but for the gentle stories they whisper. If you enjoyed this slow journey through snow goggles and survival, please consider giving the video a like and subscribing for more quiet stories from history's attic. Until next time, sleep well, and may your dreams be just boring enough, and good night.